Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ESG Talks, a KBRA podcast series focusing on environmental, social, and governance (ESG). This podcast series highlights various ESG hot topics and includes commentary from prominent voices within the ESG community. In this episode of ESG Talks, Karen Daly, Senior Managing Director and Head of KBRA's Public Finance Team, interviews Anne Coglianese, the Chief Resilience Officer of the City of Jacksonville, Florida. Anne is Jacksonville's first Chief Resilience Officer and has been in the role since 2019. Before joining Jacksonville City Government, Anne held various roles focused on the environment and climate change, including as the Coastal Resilience Program Manager for the City of New Orleans and the Special Assistant for Climate Preparedness for the White House Council on Environmental Quality. In her Chief Resilience Officer role, Anne leads the development and implementation of resilience initiatives to ensure Jacksonville can adapt and thrive in the face of acute shocks and chronic stresses brought on by climate change.
Anne, we are delighted to have you with us today. You are Jacksonville's first Chief Resilience Officer, and this is a relatively new job title in municipal governments around the country. Can you talk about what resiliency means in the context of climate change? And what are the main roles of a Chief Resilience Officer?
First of all, thank you so much for having me and for facilitating this conversation. You're right, Chief Resilience Officers are fairly new, and the term resilience can mean so many different things depending on the context. So for the purpose of my work, we're really talking about city resilience, and I define that as the ability of city systems to adapt and thrive in the face of acute shocks and chronic stresses. When we're talking about shocks that can affect a city, those are acute events that can have an extreme impact on a community. Things like hurricanes are top of mind, extreme fluctuations in temperature that can cause infrastructure disruptions. We're also looking at things that are separate from climate, like cyber attacks and how that could impact a municipality. And then on the stresses side of things, these are not acute events. They're slower moving over time, but can nonetheless erode the fabric of a community. So here in Jacksonville, that's things like sea level rise, the slow encroachment of extreme heat, poverty, aging infrastructure. Those aren't acute points in time, but if we neglect them for too long, we can have serious issues. And the other thing I'll say about city resilience is that it looks different everywhere. So Jacksonville's really drilled down on what the shocks and stressors are that are key to our community, and key to our community, not just in the here and now, but over the next 30 to 50 years. So we're really doing long-term strategic planning for the city and really getting at those drivers of change that are most likely to impact. So climate's one. Jacksonville is posed for a lot of population growth over the coming decades. So that's another driver of change that we really look at. And the main point is just to make sure that we're putting in place policies and projects and programs that can help make sure that Jacksonville is a vibrant place to live for decades to come.
Thank you for that. I'm going to pick up on a theme from the first question, which is thinking about Jacksonville. What are the main risks the city faces as the effects of climate change become more extreme?
Well, if your listeners have never been to Jacksonville, I'm going to start with just painting the picture a little bit, because I think a lot of people don't realize how large Jacksonville is. It's actually the largest city by land area in the continental U.S. And we have a lot of exposure points to the risks of flooding. Specifically, we are located at the mouth of the St. Johns River, the largest river system in Florida, where it empties out into the Atlantic Ocean. We have 3 major beach communities. The intercoastal waterway flows through our city. And the St. Johns River has 59 significant tributaries that branches off of it. So really, it's a massive network of water that we're dealing with and a lot of exposure points. But the other thing about flooding that I think we're having to deal with, both from a planning perspective, but also how we communicate risks to residents, is really understanding that flooding isn't just one thing in Jacksonville. We actually have 5 different types of flooding that are occurring in any given moment. We have 2 types of coastal flooding. One is storm surge that we see during major hurricane events that really push water up into our river system and can cause catastrophic flooding. We also have extreme high tide events, which are becoming more and more prevalent and are more of a nuisance for our residents. On the rainfall side of things, we see riverine flooding. So when we get a heavy rainstorm event, our 59 tributaries, the water levels can begin to rise. And if the tributary overtops its banks, that's when we start to see flooding in people's backyards and in their homes. And then we also have issues of stormwater flooding from rainfall, where that water may not be making it to a tributary, but it's pooling on a street or a sidewalk, and it's causing, again, nuisance flooding for our residents. And then the kind of fifth category is a bit of a catch-all. We have compound flooding. So what happens when one or more of these flood events happen in a given moment? And so that adds a layer of variability that we're having to plan for. We also are really focused on extreme heat as a major risk that we're facing. I often say that flooding might be the most expensive hazard that we face in Jacksonville, but we know that heat is the most deadly. And across the board, across the US, that's the case, that extreme heat takes more lives than any other climate-related hazard. I also think it's what's going to make people want to live in Jacksonville 20 years from now, or frankly, want to live anywhere else. And so really the ways that we're planning for extreme heat and what our land cover looks like and what our built neighborhoods look like is going to have a huge impact on residents' quality of life in the future. We're also looking spatially at wildfire and wind. I think one thing that I was really unprepared for moving to Jacksonville and taking on this role is the fact that there are periods of drought that can happen over the course of decades in Jacksonville, and there have been past incidents of wildfires. So I think much like in recent weeks, we've been seeing flooding happening in California, where their main hazard typically is too little water and leading to wildfires. They're now getting hit with this presence of too much water and the issues that it can cause. Similarly, here in Jacksonville, we're constantly thinking about water and our relationship with it. We do have to watch our back and make sure that we're planning for those moments where we may not have enough water and the environmental issues that can come from a wildfire event. And then, no surprise, extreme wind is something that absolutely pairs with hurricane season here in Florida. And if we're seeing stronger and more frequent hurricane events, then spatially planning for wind is also part of assessing our risks to climate change.
That is quite interesting. I'd like to turn our focus to data for a minute. And how would you think about the importance of data collection in terms of how you think about current and projected risk for the city and plan for resiliency projects?
Data is very central to the way that Jacksonville is structuring its resilience planning work. Due to the size of our city, it's taken about a year to get complete data layers on flooding and on heat. We now have those, and we're able to start layering in census data and other vulnerability indicators to give us just a very complete picture of our risks and vulnerabilities to these different types of hazards. In general, we're seeing an uptick in the number of extreme precipitation events that we're going to be seeing by mid-century. It looks like it could be roughly 1.5 to 2 times the amount of extreme precipitation events. On the tidal side, we're also seeing an uptick in the number of extreme high tide days. Right now, we get about 4 a year, but by mid-century, it could be somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 days a year. So this is really important for us to know. Maybe it's not something that our residents are concerned with today in vast parts of the city, but if we know that this is going to become more and more prevalent, it does need to be part of how we're planning for it. On the heat side of things, we're also seeing some projections that lend a sense of urgency to this work. Roughly a 40% increase in the number of days where the heat index is over 90 degrees. And another kind of factor that we're really looking at is warm night. How many nights are we going to be seeing in a year where the temperature doesn't drop below 75 degrees? And that's really when we start to see a lot more of the public health concerns surrounding heat. So heat stroke, heat illness. And by mid-century, we could have roughly 50 to 100 additional warm nights. So really, this data is allowing us to lend a sense of urgency to this work. We've also been able to plot some of our flood challenges spatially and really looking at our current conditions for a 10 and a 100-year storm event, but also layering in 2.3 feet of sea level rise and running those projections again. We're then able to look at how many parcels are impacted by this. And we're doing that on a number of asset classes: residential properties, commercial facilities, utilities and critical infrastructure, cultural and community services, vacant lands. And then we're able to start to see kind of where do we as the city need to be focusing our efforts, our funding, our capital improvement plan. So that's for coastal storm. We're doing the same thing for all of those asset classes, looking at floodplain inundation from a 100-year and a 500-year storm event, really looking at how extreme rainfall is going to affect our assets spatially throughout the city. So it's really bringing a level of rigor that hasn't been present in Jacksonville, but I also think is really new in the field, really getting down to that parcel level and being able to say with a great amount of confidence where we need to focus our time and our energy to make kind of the biggest impact for our residents and ensure that we're able to provide the same level of service that they're expecting to minimize the level of disruption and to get things back to normal as quickly as possible when we do see these disruptions happen.
That's a lot to think about. Maybe we could dive a little bit more into the data issue. How do you connect relevant climate data to the city's decision-making process?
Absolutely. I think a lot of cities have taken the time and the care to gather their risk data. And so I would say that Jacksonville is not unique in that sense. But one thing that I do think is more unique is that we're gathering these data sets with a very clear intention of folding those directly into a number of policy updates. We are looking at updating the city's land development regulations within the next year and a half, working with the development community and these large data sets to start thinking about where are areas of the city that have high exposure to risks, where are the areas of the city that are lowest risks and are farthest away from some of these hazards like flooding. And then how do we as the city encourage development in the spaces that we know are safest and discourage or encourage smarter design of projects in the areas that we know will have exposure to risk. So I think really the idea that we're gathering data for the purpose of using it to guide that regulatory update is one of the ways that we're trying to really innovate. And I think this data will allow us to really explore incentive-based regulations around development in a very smart way so that we can really claim if we're putting up this incentive, this is why we feel confident that we will see this return based on our risk data. We're also looking at connecting this data to a large internal policy update of our public works design standards. So I think it's important if we're potentially looking at the private development community and saying we need to modify how this development takes place. It's important that the city is also at the table saying we're going to build differently, we're going to build smarter. And so taking this data and folding it very intentionally into a design standard update is one way that we'll be able to make sure every project in the city's capital improvement plan has been reviewed on some level for resilience. And we can feel really confident that those aren't just one-time investments. Those are investments that are going to serve us for the long term.
Fascinating. Can we talk a little bit about a couple of programs that Jacksonville is currently working on to address climate risk?
Well, everything I've talked about so far is part of a large planning process that's currently underway in the city of Jacksonville to develop a comprehensive city resilience strategy that will look at coastal and climate adaptation and really serve as a strategic guiding document for the next 30 to 50 years of Jacksonville's future. On top of that, while we're working on that, there are things that we're putting on the ground right here and now. We're looking at two of our main urban tributaries where we know we have chronic flooding issues, where development has really encroached on the watershed of these bodies and are leading to a lot of neighborhood flooding. The first is McCoy's Creek. This is a project that got underway after the city sustained flooding during Matthew and Irma and is already hitting the ground. Pieces of it are in construction right now. And when we saw Hurricane Ian and Tropical Storm Nicole hit Florida earlier this year, it was really exciting to already see this tributary restoration project in action and see flooding slightly alleviated from the portions of the project that have been developed. So further work on that McCoy's Creek project and then Hogan's Creek, another urban tributary where some early hydrologic modeling of preliminary designs show that we could potentially reduce flooding in neighborhoods by about 3 feet just by giving the creek places to go when it has either high tidal volume or that high riverine volume and really restoring that natural watershed. So really exciting projects that are already underway here in Jacksonville. And I think that guiding document, the comprehensive resilience strategy, will really be able to scale up some of these solutions.
Well, we're at our last question, so I'm going to be a little provocative. And what would you say to financial market participants that think Florida is a bad investment because of its exposure to climate change?
It's the question that I get asked a lot. And I'll say everywhere has risk. There's no part of the country or the world that's really immune to seeing impacts from climate change. I think what makes Florida different is that we've been aware of this for a long time. We've been aware of hurricanes since before climate change was really on the public radar. And so we know how to handle hurricanes. We have emergency procedures in place. We have ways that we're able to predict this and anticipate this. So I think Florida, in some ways, is actually ahead of other parts of the country in being really strategic and prepared for addressing climate change. The other thing I'll say is that Jacksonville is unique among Florida in the sense that one of our biggest assets is how much open space we have in Jacksonville. Only roughly 40% of the city is currently built out and developed. So really what I see from a resilience perspective, and something that I think should make the financial community really interested in Jacksonville, is it's about how we develop the remaining land in Jacksonville, being really intentional and strategic to make sure that we're not just addressing the problems that we already know exist from the areas that have been built out, but that we're building out the rest of the space in a smart way to minimize issues of flooding and to maximize the value of our high and dry land, and to encourage dense and robust development in those areas. So I think Jacksonville, unlike a lot of other parts of Florida and other major cities that are very space constrained and whose resilience programs are really limited to just looking at how you retrofit, we're able to look at what does a resilient community look like from the get-go and put in place, like I said, regulatory policies or these public works policies that will guide that development to be as smart as possible. And I think from a financial perspective, that's going to reduce the price tag that comes with storm events if and when they hit Jacksonville, and really ensure that our community is able to bounce back very quickly when we do have these disruptions. But once again, I just echo that the main thing to think about is everywhere has risks. So whether it's Florida, whether it's another part of the country, people who are investing need to really be thinking about risk when they're making their investment. And just because you're away from a water body doesn't inherently mean that you are free of thinking about flooding or any other climate hazard that may be present.
Thank you to Karen and Anne for a very interesting discussion. Please email esg@kbra.com with any questions or comments. We also encourage you to visit KBRA's ESG website at esg.kbra.com, where you can find ESG research related to the topics discussed in this episode, further details on KBRA's ESG approach, and other ESG-related media items. You can also join our mailing list to access our ESG Weekly Roundup newsletter. This concludes our episode. Please visit kbra.com to access our other podcast series, as well as our readings and research.